And let me say up front that I'm a believer in the Korean-U.S. alliance. I don't think that there can be any successful outcome versus North Korea that does not rest on the foundation of a strong Korea-U.S. alliance. And I just have to echo that our alliance is based on shared values, and every Korean that I know that I interact with shares these values with Americans. Freedom and individual liberty, liberal democracy, free market economy, and human rights. And that is really the foundation of our alliance. And of course, as mentioned, Korea raised from the ashes of the war in 1953 with the miracle on the Han, and a country that is now really a great middle power and grew economically, culturally, and politically into the country that it is today. And so the United States and Korea, we share these values, and I believe in the strength of the alliance. I don't need to really talk about the North Korean strategy, but I look at the Kim family regime and what they're all about. But to me, unification under Northern domination is really key to regime survival. And the way that the North acts, I believe, is through subversion, coercion, extortion, and if necessary, the use of force to achieve unification. That is the main threat to the Republic of Korea. And of course, I think North Korea has a divide and conquer strategy. Divide the ROC-U.S. alliance and conquer the ROC. I mean, that's really what it's all about. I think we should keep that in mind and understand that. But subversion is something that I really want to talk about. This is the undermining of the power and authority of an established system or institution, the Republic of Korea, or the ruthless subversion of democracy. And I think we've heard in the testimony of our previous speakers really what that ruthless subversion may be all about. Of course, from a United States perspective, George Kennan, Mr. X, looking at the Soviet Union, he looked at political warfare. And this political warfare, overt and covert operations, in the absence of declared war, white propaganda, covert operations as clandestine support of friendly foreign elements, black psychological warfare, and encouragement of underground resistance in hostile states. I think both Ambassador Lee and Daniel described much of that in their talk. And from a United States doctrinal perspective, myself as a retired Special Forces officer, we practice and study unconventional warfare, and again, a resistance movement or insurgency to coerce, disrupt, or overthrow a government or occupying power. An underground auxiliary or guerrilla force. And again, the testimonies of Ambassador Lee and Daniel have described underground activities in a society. Now, this is an excerpt from the Department of Defense, the U.S. Department of Defense's report to Congress for 2017, published this May of 2018. And these last two items here, just to highlight the United Front Department and what it does. And this is what the Department of Defense told Congress. The United Front Department overtly attempts to establish pro-North Korean groups in the ROC. Okay? And the 225th Bureau trains agents to infiltrate the ROC and establish underground political parties focused on fomenting unrest and revolution. We don't think about that in the United States, but our Department of Defense, our intelligence community, recognizes and understands these organizations and has reported on them to our Congress. So for me, when I think about Congress, there are five big, I think about Korea, there are five big things to look at. Obviously, war is the worst case. We want to deter war. We do not want war, and that's why the United States has a presence on the Korean Peninsula. When Wang Jung-yap defected in 1997, he told us that the reason North Korea hasn't attacked is because of the presence of U.S. troops. Regime collapse. From listening to the presentations, it sounds like North Korea is very strong, but we don't know what's really going on inside Pyongyang. And we have to be very wary of what happens to Kim Jong-un. And of course, the conditions that lead to collapse could lead to his decision to go to war as the only way to survive. So regime collapse may not be something we really want to wish for because it could be very dangerous. But we must prepare for it. Human rights and crimes against humanity, if there's one thing that anybody from the media here would take away, I'd like to make this quote. Human rights is a national security issue. Okay, the human rights in North Korea is a national security issue. North Korea denies human rights of the Korean people living in the north to remain in power. And we should keep that in mind. It uses its people to gain hard currency, through illicit activities, through slave labor, through mining uranium by political prisoners. All of that supports the regime. So human rights is a national security issue. It's also a moral imperative, obviously. There are 25 million Koreans living in the north who are suffering. But from a national security issue, we should keep in mind, every time we talk about North Korea's nuclear program, we reinforce Kim Jong-un's legitimacy. But when we talk about human rights in North Korea, it undermines legitimacy. And if we recall what happened after the UN Commission of Inquiry in 2014, North Korea was on the defensive, and we should keep that in mind. Of course, asymmetric threats, those of a weaker country, North Korea, weaker than the ROC-US alliance, using alternative forms and strategies to overcome the strong. And of course, they use provocations to gain economic and political concessions. Its nuclear program for extortion and blackmail, missile, cyber attacks. While peace is apparently breaking out in the Korean Peninsula, North Korea continues to conduct cyber operations to steal money, to gain information, and to prepare its use for possibly use during conflict. And of course, subversion of the Republic of Korea is one of the greatest asymmetric threats that exists. And obviously, the global illicit activities that Department 39 conducts to gain hard currency around the world really needs to be addressed. But those four big problems can only be solved through unification, and unification in the correct way. And I'll just touch on that. I just share this slide with you. It's very complex because we wrote this in the 1990s to illustrate the complexity, the uncertainty of the Korean problem. Collapse can lead to war, implosion, explosion. Ultimately we want peace, but there's probably no direct line from the current conditions to peace without going through some form of this. And you can see the terrible things that will occur, refugees, mass starvation, defections, and all of the conflict that could occur if regime collapse occurs. So for me, after the summits, 3 North-South summits, 1 U.S. North summit, soon to be a second one. The fundamental questions: has Kim Jong-un given up his strategy, the 70-year-old strategy to unify the peninsula by force, or through subversion, coercion, extortion, to ensure regime survival? Has it given up the strategy to split the ROC-US alliance? But most importantly, what do we want to achieve in Korea? I ask this of Americans. We think about Korea. What do we want to achieve? And of course, more specifically, what is the durable political or acceptable political arrangement on the Korean Peninsula and in Northeast Asia that's going to serve and protect U.S. and ROC-US alliance interests? We should answer those questions. Okay, we should. And I don't know many people that really think about them in detail. Now, the North strategy, the key problem with the summit agreements, denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Both President Moon and President Trump adopted Kim Jong-un's narrative, denuclearization of the entire peninsula. So, first, declaration of the end of the war, sanctions relief, denuclearization of the South, which is really defined by the North as the end of the alliance, removal of U.S. troops, and the end of the nuclear umbrella. Then, maybe Kim Jong-un will negotiate dismantlement of its nuclear program. And if he does that, I'm sure he'll cheat. So, I don't need to talk about the challenge of the North, but I do want to highlight, we all know that the legitimacy of the regime is built on the myth of anti-Japanese partisan warfare, that Kim Il-sung was a great guerrilla leader. And it is the guerrilla ethos that will continue, that is embraced by the regime, that is most dangerous, both in terms of war, collapse, but also undermining its subversive efforts of the ROC. Of course, Wang Zhongyao described what he called dear leader absolutism, and this really is the way to describe the tragic life of the Korean people living in the North. So we should not forget this. Adrian Buzo wrote a book called Guerrilla Dynasty, and I just highlight this last line. Above all, North Korean nationalism stressed that the guerrilla ethos was not only the supreme, but also the only legitimate basis on which to reconstitute a reunified Korea. And so we need to keep that in mind, and everything the United Front Department does, is about subversion. It's about achieving reunification through subversion, coercion, and of course, if necessary, use of force. So the bottom line is we're not going to see an end to the nuclear program and the threats and the crimes against humanity that are being committed against the Korean people living in the North. And I like to use the phrase Korean people living in the North because it is one Korea. Those crimes are being committed by what the late Stephen Bradner called the mafia-like crime family cult, known as the Kim family regime. But it's only going to be achieved through a united Republic of Korea. That is, of course, secure, stable, non-nuclear, economically vibrant, and unified under a liberal constitutional form of government determined by the Korean people. Now, there are paths to unification. Peaceful unification is the desired path. I think you should plan for it because actually peaceful unification is the most difficult to achieve. It's the most unlikely to occur, but the most difficult to achieve. And if you plan for peaceful unification, everything you plan for peaceful unification will be used in the other path. Of course, war is the fastest way to unification. Obviously, we don't want to expend the blood or treasure. Regime collapse is another way, but of course that could lead to some form of conflict, if not war. And then, of course, what we don't talk about is internal regime removal inside the North with emerging leadership that may seek peaceful unification. Do people really think about that? Everybody here talks about subversion of the rock. What is going on inside North Korea and what kind of resistance that exists? I'm reminded of listening to the speeches, the past presentations. The late John McEwen wrote a book called The Art of Counter-Revolutionary Warfare. It was focused on Vietnam, but many of the principles in that really have application to what Ambassador Lee and Daniel were talking about. So that may be another path. But we should always talk about peaceful unification, though not from the Juche perspective that has been described. Before I close, I will just touch on the agreements. The Pyongyang Declaration for the implementation of the historic Panmunjom Declaration in the military domain. The Korean government, I don't think, did a very good job negotiating the military terms. You talk about what's going on the DMZ. There's some very, very troubling aspects. Of course, we heard Secretary Pompeo challenge Minister Khan, and rightly so, because that's what alliance partners do. We tell the truth, we are blunt, and the agreement between North and South is not a good one for South Korea. I like to call it the asymmetric alternate armistice on steroids. It is on steroids because it expands the armistice, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's asymmetric because all of the confidence building measures are on the South side, and there are none on the North. As you all know, the South Korean military is postured to defend South Korea. The North Korean military is postured to attack South Korea. And we should keep that in mind. And so, people are focused on the removal of the landmines in the DMZ, which is troubling. But there are some things that are really, really troubling. One is the restriction on training near the DMZ. This, and Ambassador Lee mentioned 4,000 artillery pieces or 5,000, but there's actually 14,000 artillery pieces along the entire DMZ. And it's very important that the South Korean military and the U.S. military train to be able to counter that artillery. But this agreement restricts the frontline training, so that weakens the defenses. The no-fly zone weakens our intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities, our eyes on North Korea to be able to see their preparations for an attack. And so these things, now of course, they're going to return the joint security area to the pre-1976 configuration and remove weapons, remove guard posts. And of course on the south side, 13 anti-tank barriers are in the process of being removed. And of course the historic invasion route, Kaesong-Munsan, only 35 miles to Seoul, puts Seoul at risk. So this agreement is very asymmetric, one-sided. Last week I met with a delegation of the Minju Party that was here, visiting last week to explain all of this, and I of course challenged them on this. I said, why did your negotiators not ask North Korea to reposition its artillery? move their artillery 20 to 40 kilometers to the rear. You know, why did they not do that? And of course, the answer was, that's too much to ask of the North Koreans. And one of the assemblymen said to me, but there is no more threat from the North. And I replied, maybe you're not hearing the verbal threats, but there has been no reduction in the North Korean threat against South Korea. None whatsoever. And in fact, we have seen them continue to develop fissile material, and they continue to train, and the offensive capabilities and the threat to the South still exist. You know, it is important that Secretary Pompeo and U.S. Military personnel challenge their counterparts, because this agreement puts South Korea, ROC, and U.S. military forces at risk. And we need to call that out. I will continue to do that. But in the end, as I said, the only acceptable, durable political arrangement is going to be a united Republic of Korea. And I think someday there will be no North Korea and South Korea, but a united Republic of Korea, because that is really the solution to what the armistice called in paragraph 60, the answer to the Korea question, which is, of course, the unnatural division of the peninsula. So I'll close there. Thank you.